2024 was a weird year. I somehow aced organic chemistry, and then my teacher forced me to read Winnie the Pooh. I found out the hard way that you should take your time when shaving your balls with a less than ideal razor. I was forced to play Genshin only for the person making me play it to also get bored within the first 5 minutes of watching. It started a small cult of like-minded McWaffling shitters. But none of that matters in comparison to one gargantuan event. You know what that is? The Jschlatt Christmas album. Why is it actually good? Okay, we can talk about metal I liked now. There are very few phrases out there that inexplicably annoy me as much as, "it's just a vibe." I don't know why, but I genuinely get physically upset upon hearing it sometimes. That being said, I admit that those are the exact words that I would use to describe Vortex of the Worlds by Labyrinthus Stellarum. The description of atmospheric black metal is really as accurate as it gets, and it's nice to see some material from this genre that's not an unnecessary hour-long slog, but still feels like a complete album. It's got my favorite funny screaming that's almost impossible to understand a single word of, broken up by interludes that sound like they're ripped straight out of an Stella knockoff. If that sounds stupid to you, I mean yeah, it kinda is, but they somehow make it work regardless. As weird as it is, my favorite track from this is probably the goofy opener, Transcendence. It's got beautiful synth moments that sound like they fit perfectly on one of those zoom out shots of an entire galaxy, broken up by exciting bursts of screams and drums foreshadowing the general heavier direction the next few songs are about to take. And all of this is accompanied by whatever the fuck you'd call this noise. Another highlight for me is the last minute or so of the album. It more than any part of the album really just knocked the feeling of some world-ending Lovecraftian event out of the park. It's goofy and probably not everyone's cup of tea, but I think anyone who's into prog metal of any sort or just generally likes the sound of an out-of-body-ish type experience should at least give Vortex of the Worlds a try. Despite the fact that I love the metal subgenres Opeth inhabits, I've never been a huge fan of theirs. I listened to Blackwater Park a couple years ago, and while there were undoubtedly some great moments on it, I always thought that it was too bloated for me to get much of a kick out of. I tried listening to a couple other albums of theirs, and I unfortunately felt the same about a lot of them too. Thankfully though, a friend of mine pushed me to listen to their latest release, Last Will and Testament, and I can say that out of all the Opeth I've listened to so far, this is easily my favorite. It's groovy and bouncy one minute, then almost spooky and ominous the next. The album sounds like it was meant to be the accompanying soundtrack to a noir investigative drama, the soundtrack to a kid's Halloween movie,
The word of Christ tells us to forgive transgressions.
and it would play when you entered a gothic cathedral all at once. And all of this is just from the first two songs. What's amazing is that not only does the album keep this level of surprise up for the entirety of its 50-minute runtime, all these pieces are stitched together damn near seamlessly, and nothing feels out of place. Also, all the instrumentals here are great, but the growling bass fits especially well. I don't know how you make music for 3 decades and still have it sound this good, but Last Will and Testament still manages to be a great album. Similar to Opeth, Knocked Loose has always been a band that I've just barely not been a big fan of. I've always liked their general sound, but they have never fully clicked with me until this one. I remember getting the dumbest grin on my face when I made it through the first few songs of this album because I finally got what people liked about this band. Every single song on here is pure, screaming fun. I'm not a huge fan of Poppy or Motionless in White, and yet I also love both of their guest appearances on here, especially Poppy's vocal contributions to Suffocate. She and Knocked Loose's lead vocalist Brian Garris play off of each other so well here, and I haven't even touched on the delightful, though maybe that's a little too happy of a word for it, instrumental side of each and every song here. I normally have a hard time distinguishing and pointing to individual riffs or motifs as my favorite in this heavier hardcore, break-it-down-ish style of punk, but that's not the case here. They all fit the album's themes and heavy sound perfectly, but somehow largely also manage not to step on each other's toes. Also, the Jimmy Kimmel performance was so fucking good and led to some of the best internet funnies I've seen in a while, so they get bonus points there. Eviscerate by Eidola is one of the most addictive albums I've heard this year. On some level, yeah, this is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. The lyrics are stupid, the structure is stupid, the album literally opens with a JFK speech which transitions into this, very deep and meaningful segment.
So help us God.
I have no pain to suffer. I will watch as everything that I love dies.
And then it's just 30 minutes of this fairly predictable, but still fun metalcore with weird bits of piano and synth scattered throughout. Then they go back to being philosophical by just directly quoting the British philosopher Alan Watts.
For on the one hand, there is the real world, and on the other, a whole system of symbols about that world, which we have in our minds.
And then it's a couple more minutes of overly dramatic and goofy choruses.
Well, I made up my mind. I know that you can't save me.
And then the album just fucking ends with weirdly pretty piano playing. This album's lyrics constantly swap between absolute 5th grader and Judas, just directly quoting a former president of the US or a British philosopher, and actually kind of good. I genuinely can't tell if these lyrics were intentionally over the top, or if they were trying to play it straight, but either way this album is a stupid blast that kept me entertained for more time than I'd like to admit. Every time Mirar releases new music, I'm confident that it can't be any more evil sounding than the last release, and every single time I'm proven horribly wrong. Mirar somehow strikes this perfect balance between sophisticated, nicely tied together guitar work that also incorporates some pretty classical piano and harp, and then just the most unhinged, almost painful sounding noises I've ever heard. Listening to this almost feels illegal, and yet, just like the other illegal thing I did in September of 2001, it just feels so good. Even ignoring the absolute degeneracy of Mirar's sound, the riffs alone release an unholy amount of dopamine and tickle my ear holes in just the right way. In my opinion, Mirar is tied with Siddhartha as the best thal act out there right now, and I can't recommend their work enough. Though it's ironic given its name, Time 2 by Wintersun is probably the least time-efficient album I'll be talking about today. If you're someone who really needs their music to get from point A to point B in a timely manner, then you're probably going to get somewhat frustrated by this one. However, if you're instead like me and listening to prog metal has melted your brain to be able to put up with 30-minute songs misleadingly titled 3-minute warning, you'll probably love it. While it might take us time getting from place to place, the journey it takes you on is undeniably a blast. I'm an absolute sucker for music that just slowly layers and layers on itself for like 5 minutes before just putting it all together inside a nice bloopy? Is bloopy even a word? It should be. A bloopy guitar solo. It's like the greasiest deluxe meat lovers XXL stuffed crust pizza of music. It may not be the most organized, but delivers in spades when it comes to delicious, satisfying sound. This is like if Time 2 was more time efficient, but also somehow 20 minutes longer. I've put the Poetic Edda and the Tower Part 1 together because 1. I can't decide which I like more, and 2. They're both at least partially by the same artist, Disembodied Tyrant, and 3. They're pretty similar and most of my comments and criticisms of one can be applied to the other. According to Spotify, the 4 songs from the Poetic Edda EP are all within my top 5 most played tracks this year. This might not be entirely true because right around when my Wrapped was released, I discovered the number 1 album on this list, and it's likely taken over the top 5 since then. However, just because these 2 releases are no longer number 1, doesn't mean they aren't absolutely fantastic. The Poetic Edda kinda took me and a lot of others by complete surprise earlier this year. I had never heard of Disembodied Tyrant or Synestia, and it seemed like the entirety of the deathcore audience's attention had been shifted to them overnight, and rightfully so. The Poetic Edda is a nice 20-minute bite-sized EP that is infinitely replayable. The vocals are more of that insane screaming that you can't understand a word of, except for some reason the lyrics are actually good. This is even more true for the Tower Part 1, but it's worth mentioning here too. In terms of instrumentals, everything here is stellar. I wouldn't say I'm starting to grow tired of so many bands working in violins and softer instruments into metal, but it's become so common that I'm not too regularly overly excited about it. That is not the case here. No single instrument overstays its welcome, and the way the heavier guitars sometimes mirror the weirdly pretty strings that preceded them for just a second or two before carrying on to the next idea, which is somehow always equally enjoyable, is marvelous. However, I do have one criticism of the Poetic Edda, and that is the structure of its songs. It's mostly fine, but they're a little too overly reliant on ending these songs with moments of near silence broken up by heavier sounding mimics of what came before. Each of the endings is nice, and individually I like them a lot in fact, but when looking at the EP as a whole, I think they could have been a bit more varied. However, this is also the reason why I'm inclined to say that the Tower Part 1 might be slightly better, because it largely doesn't have this issue. In fact, not only are its endings more varied, each of the songs in that EP are wildly more distinct from one another and feel more like they have individual purposes, at least more so than the Poetic Edda. Setting aside this admittedly somewhat needless complaint, though, these two EPs are phenomenal, and if you're a fan of any sort of metal, I'd say both of these are must-listens. This is like if the other albums were actually good.